Welcome to the first in a series that I'd like to do called Will It Mud, and today we'll go over a simple patch. This patch will be about as easy as they come, and the reason why I say that is even though the sheetrock is busted through, there's a lot of support behind there, so I'm not actually going to cut this out like you normally would for a hole in the middle of the wall. I'm actually going to leverage the fact that there's a lot of strength in the sheetrock behind there, and there's actually some insulation behind there as well that's adding to the strength that I see here. So this is about as easy as patches come. And I wanted to give a shout out to a good friend of mine, Brandon Green, who's encouraged me to really step into doing some videos, and also Walker Pugh, and apologies if I mispronounce your name. But thank you for encouraging me to really get this up and going. So first things first, we'll go through the tools and material required to get through this patch. So we have a bucket of water, and we have a couple tools that I like to use for mixing up quickset. We have some mesh tape, and we're not going to get into this video today about the advantages or disadvantages of mesh tape versus paper tape. I'm just going to use it for this patch because I'm positive it will suffice. Got a 6-inch knife and a pan. And also have a hopper that we'll use to wrap up the job with at the end to spray some texture. This is a textured wall. And lastly, since we're going to be using some quickset as our mud material, we're going to use a sponge sander that helps you save a little bit of time in that as the material is drying, without it being totally dry, you can use the sponge sander to kind of smooth out any lines or any edges that you might have. So prep this a little bit, and on the topic of prep, it's always a good idea to lay out a drop cloth or do some masking. A little bit of prep work in that way goes a long way. And what I have down below me is actually a drop cloth. You can't see it in the camera. And how I'm gonna prep this is with just a little sheetrock knife. What I'm looking for here is anything that's kind of curled up, any paper that's peeling. As you can see, I'm kind of cutting that on a little bit of a bevel. And what this will do is just kind of get anything out of there that's going to fuzz on you or cause any air bubbles in your patching process. I'm just kind of going around cutting some of those out. And look also, as I'm going through, looking for anything that is weak. So as you can see that I'm kind of pushing just to see if there's any weak spots that need to be cut out anymore. And in this particular case, I don't see any further weakness in the actual structure of the rock. Next, we're going to mix up our quickset. On the topic of quickset, I use Proform quickset. I find that over USG or other products, you get a better consistency in terms of the time that it sets and the time that it dries, and it actually when it does dry, you get a much better finish, I feel. That's something that you can sand versus a very hardened surface that other products have. So in the pan here, you can see that I have just about that much. It's probably more than enough. I'm gonna just take a little bit of a sponge to get my water into the pan, and then we're gonna start mixing. So the consistency that we're looking for here is pretty thick. I would say the consistency of maybe bread dough. It's a good look for consistency that you'd be looking for the pre-fill, and that's what we're about to do, is to pre-fill this patch. So I'm just kind of turning the material with the water. Just turning this around with my knife. I decided not to use the paddles there that I mentioned earlier, simply because there's not a ton of material that we're spinning up here. With those paddles, you can actually use a drill. So if you're using an entire pan of mud, for instance, that comes in handy because it whips up the mud to a nice consistency for you. So as you can see here, this is sticking to my knife. It's about as much as I've mixed up. So for this particular patch, we have, basically a knife full of material. All right. So now we're going to start the pre-fill process. Now, what we're looking for here is to pack the hole, and ideally we don't want anything pooching out, so that's what we're looking for. So I'm just pushing that in there, and I'm pulling it off, any excess. And it helps to go around. You see that I went this way and then I went this way. That just helps get the material in there to the edges that we're trying to get the mud to stick to. You can see that I'm working the material to fill in any of those gaps that are kind of happening as the material is going in and setting against the rock that's kind of broken behind there. I want to go ahead and try to get all of those out of there that I can. So probably can't see it in the camera here, but there's just a small little gap that's happening there as I pull. So I'm just trying to fix all of those. So as you can see, we have a nice full amount of mud in there, and then we're going to let that set up. Once it sets up, we'll start the next part of the process. In the meantime, it's a good idea to clean off any outer edges. So all I'm doing there is putting more pressure to the left or right of the knife to give it more pressure on that outer edge, and then kind of feathering it in. It's not super critical to be perfect at this point, because this really is just a pre-filled step. And we'll come back when that is dry. So due to those inconsistencies with the timing of the mud setting off, one little tip that I like to do is I'll take a little dollop of it. As you can see, it's starting to harden already, and what I'll do is I'll put that on my shoe or my shoulder. Use my shoulder in this case because you can see it, and because it's already hardening, it's not adhering to my shoulder. But if I'm working with longer mud, it's more useful to do this. But once you have it on your shoulder or your shoe, you can kind of tap it to see if it's dry enough to come back to. So oftentimes there's other steps and things on the job site that you can be doing while you have something drying out for you. So that'll leave you with that tip. On to the next step, we're going to use our mesh tape and our 6-inch knife and start to tape up our patch. It is worth mentioning that with the right level of skill set, and if you're comfortable, you can actually do these next 2 steps, which is taping and filling during the pre-fill process. Being that I'm doing a video and I'm trying to guide the typical homeowner on how to do this, it's not worth going over some of those extra skill type things, which is to make sure that the mud's not pooching out. There's some extra steps that you've got to do once the drying process is done if you try to do the pre-fill, taping, and filling all at the same time. Maybe we can do that in a future video. So I think that this is, especially given this type of hole, this is going to have, more material in the middle. Sometimes it'll kind of stick out from the wall. So just mentioning that in case anybody's watching that knows that they can do those 3 steps at once. Again, this is one of those easier patches where we have a nice backing in there to kind of hold the mud for us. So onto the taping. What we can do is just measure our tape, hold the roll against our knife like this, and then once you've got the appropriate amount, you can just pull on it. So in this case, we're going to do a quick measure. You can kind of eyeball it. I kind of figured that was about the length that I needed for where I'm intending on placing this. Mesh tape does have a sticky side and a non-sticky side. It's one of the advantages of using mesh tape. And you just stick that over where that line is. The line meaning the outline of the patch itself. So I have one at the top, bottoms and sides. Pushing that on there. This first one's not sticking too well, so I'm actually going to replace that with another piece. So we have our top and bottom. Sides. In this case, just because I feel like it, I'm going to stick a piece right in the center. So probably can't see it too well in the camera, but this is completely covered in mesh tape, the entire hole there. So we have that. The next step is I will mix up some more quickset. Again, I'm using that 5-minute mud, and we'll start the fill process. On the topic of the mud pooching out, this would also typically pooch out if we have a hole like this. But again, this particular hole isn't doing that to us because it has so much backing there for us already. And with the pooching out, if that is occurring on one of your projects, what you would do is once the material is set up is kind of scrape that down flat before you start the next process. While that's drying, being that we're using a quick setting material, you're going to want to clean your pan. And this speed of mud is actually 5 minutes. So after you get it mixed up, you have about 5 minutes to work with it. Generally, it's more like 8 to 10. It just kind of depends on the batch of mud that you get, the batch of mud that you purchase, how old it is, how much moisture that is drawn over time, and due to those different factors, you have more or less time. Okay, we have our mud mixed up, same process as before. Get the material in the pan, add a little bit of water, look for the type of consistency. In this case, the consistency that we're going for is definitely thinner than the first pre-fill. So I would say, still stick to your knife. It might fall if you have a lot of material on there, and I would say maybe not pancake batter, but maybe waffle, and this would be good for the fill coat. So I'm gonna get some material on our pan. Always, when working with knives, keep the back of your knife clean. Put your material on there, like the back of your knife. That way you don't have anything falling onto the wall or causing it to fall into your work. So here we're going to apply the material. We're trying to hide. Well, first thing, we're going to put some mud on there and just wipe it right off. I like to do that with mesh tape so that it goes through. Just give the mesh tape a stronger bond than just the stickiness. So I'll actually go through and put the material on and pull it off. If we had a zoom in here, you would see that the material's all the way through all of the little mesh on the itself. So once I've done that little step, I immediately start the fill coat process. So we're just trying to hide. We don't need a ton on here. We're not having to do a lot of floating with this particular patch. We're just trying to hide and feather out the actual patch. And I am going beyond where the actual patch is. I probably don't need to go this far out. But you do want to go beyond the actual hole or patch that you're working with, or joint. That would be the feathering process. So what you can see here is I'm cutting out the edges. So you apply the mud, cut out the edges, and then lay your knife real flat and just pull it across there. And on the fill coat, you're not looking for a lot of perfection. Okay, the fill coat is kind of a foundation for which you're going to apply the next coat. The next coat being the skim coat. Being that this is a textured wall, my knife, if you can hear that, it's kind of scraping, and I get a lot of these little chatters. That's normal. It's definitely a little bit easier to do a patch with a smooth wall because you don't have to deal with some of that. Don't play with it too much. As you can see, it applied the mud, cut it off, and just laid it real flat. And I'm going to get this out of my pan while I still can. As before, we can take a little dollop. This time I got it before it really setting up. Put that on your shoulder or your shoe and go off and talk to the family, do some other things around the job site, and I know that I can tap it and see if it's hard enough. And I know that I can come back to the patch when it's ready. And what you're looking for when you do that tapping is you're looking for hardness, not necessarily dryness. We'll talk about that a little bit more once we get into the skim coat and the sand. With regular mud, not quickset, you are needing the material to be totally dry before the next process, but being that we're using fast setting material, you can apply the next coat even though it still has some moisture in it, and after it's hard. So I'm looking for hardness, not dryness when I'm using my timer like that. Okay, so we're going to talk about this before this is totally dry. So if you catch this at the right time, there's a point where the mud is what we say going off, where it's starting to set up, but it's not reached its full hardness. There's an opportunity to kind of perfect a little bit more that fill coat. Remember, we talked about the fill coat not being, you're not looking for perfection, whereas the skim coat, you're going to leave less material on the wall. You're just kind of closing in any imperfections that might be there. So oftentimes with the fill coat, you're going to have little mud lines, little lap marks, knife in marks, things like that. So with quickset, there's a neat opportunity to push those out a little bit and kind of rub them in, or use a sponge sander. You dip it in a little bit of water, not wet at all. So as you can see, I'm squeezing it and no water's coming out, which is kind of damp. Oftentimes you can just use the tips of your fingers and kind of push those down. If you let those lap marks stay underneath there and then you skim on top of it, it actually kind of causes more work in the sanding process. And quickset is harder to sand than regular. And on this step, as you're doing that, you can actually take your knife. You don't want to do this with very much pressure. And you can kind of push some of those lap marks down as well. So either any of those three options. You can rub them out with your fingers, you can use the sponge sander, or you can kind of push some of those down. If it's a little bit drier, you kind of miss that, you miss the right time frame to rub it down, you can also scrape those off before you get to your skin coat. Okay, we're back after we've mixed up. Talk about consistency again and the amount of material. Let's talk a little bit about that. Your pre-fill, just depending on the scenario, it's more or less material, probably less than what you would for a fill coat under normal circumstances. In this particular scenario, it's about the same material, same amount of material as what we did for a fill coat. Your fill coat is generally more than what you would use for a skim coat. So mixed up less material here. Consistency wise, before we talk about waffle batter consistency, this would be a little bit less, in between pancake and waffle batter. So it's definitely thinner than the fill coat. It should start to have problems sticking to your knife, I would say, and it also depends on the types of materials that you're using. How I've mixed this and then I'm used to this mud, this is what I'm going with. So we're mixed up. I like to do a little bit of touch up in between coats. So what I'll do is I'll just, kind of like what we did with our mesh tape, in between putting the fill coat on, just kind of come through. If I see anything that's a little bit deeper set than other things, I'll just put the material on and pull it off tight. Material on, pull it off tight. You notice that when I'm doing with my knife here, I'm putting it on one way and pulling it the other way. That's pretty typical. You'll get your mud to lay in flatter against the surface doing that, and depending on the divot or hole that you're working with, you might pull it one way versus another. You're typically going opposite the hole. So if there's a hole that's vertical, you put it on. The knife is going to be like this, and then you pull it vertically as well, if that makes sense. So again, just doing a little bit of touch up on some of those deeper set spots. Now I'm ready for my actual skim coat. So your skim coat is usually is feathering out beyond the original fill coat. So we're actually going to take it out beyond. And this one, we're going to pull it really tight. So it's actually going to look quote-unquote perfect than the fill coat that we had. So we're not wanting to leave lap marks. We're going to leave less mud, and we're wanting to pull it really tight. We're leaving less mud on. So I'm going beyond. Because remember, we're feathering here to hide and give the illusion that there's not a hole there or any humps or anything like that. So how I'm doing that is I've got my material on the knife, kind of starting out. I give it a little push so that the material is nice and the same across. And then as I'm coming across, I'm laying my knife closer to the wall. I wasn't actually against the wall, that's why that mud fell on me. But luckily, as we talked about at the beginning, we have a drop cloth down there. So that's what allows you to spread that mud pretty far. If you were to try to spread it with your knife here, you're gonna run out of mud before you get all the way over here. So just got a little bit further down here. You can still see some of my fill coat down there. So I'm just trying to cover up everything that was previously our fill coat. And again, as before, I'm going to go through and cut off all of our edges. So I'm putting more pressure with my finger towards the area that I'm cutting off. So if I'm cutting off to the right, I've got more pressure to the right. I can actually continue that all the way as far as I can go. It's a little bit difficult on this chair that I'm on. So I want to cut off those edges like we just did as soon as possible so that they're not drying out and causing you to have a less feathered edge, and you'll sometimes wind up with a very hard edge that you have to sand. So we've got everything cut off, and we're going to start to pull it tight. So it might be hard to see. We've got like a weird little thing there, so I'm just putting a little more mud on, just pulling that tight. Versus the previous coat, we left more mud on. So it's very, very tight, very smooth surface compared to the fill coat. I'm still getting a few chatters. That's pretty normal because of the textured wall. You wouldn't have so much of that with the smooth wall. So that would be your skim coat, less mud, very tight, looks more clean than the fill coat. And the skim coat is really about taking out any kind of imperfections, smoothing things out, and leaving a surface that's ready for sanding. And it reduces the amount of sanding because it's feathering everything out, and it's fixing all of those imperfections that you might have to try to really grind out. That's what we're trying to get rid of with the skim coat. Other reasons why you want a skim coat, in some scenarios you are wanting, it's kind of filling up if your mud shrink back. So that'd be another use case for a skim coat, beyond just fixing a few imperfections. With all mud, there's a little bit of shrinkage with regular mud. So with quick setting material, you don't actually have any shrinkage. So be aware of that as you're working with quickset or regular material. Whatever you leave on with regular material, there's going to be some shrinkage, and then if you're using quickset, you don't have the shrinkage happening. Thought I would do a quick close-up of our patch so far, so as you can see it's nice and clean and tight. There's a few of those chatters that I was talking about, but we're looking really good. All right, so a few things to talk about. Being that we took care of that fill coat by kind of working with it while it's still setting up, our skim coat came out really nice and tight. There's going to be very little sanding, very little working with it. The main thing that we need to worry about, because of that step, it allows you to not have to wait until it's totally dry, because the with the fill coat, remember there's those lap marks and little ripples that you're leaving on purpose so that you get a full product, and you're hiding everything, you're covering up everything underneath. Because we did that step, we're not going to have to wait for this to be totally dry, then sand it and try to take out those little lap marks. With regular mud, you would have that totally dry, that fill coat, and then you typically brush it off or scrape it really good before you did the skim coat. So being that we're working with these materials that are hard but not totally dry, that's why I did those steps where I was working with it while it was still kind of setting up, and kind of taking out some of those imperfections in between this step. This is almost totally ready. And these techniques with this hot mud are more advanced techniques, I would say, in that using these techniques, you would be able to do an entire patch in one trip. That's typically not what newer folks would be doing out the gate. So just be aware of that if you're trying to repeat some of these steps out. So on this, with burning the edge, I'm actually going to use the outer rougher part of my sponge. I'm just going to hit that. I've tried to do patches before and they just don't turn out right, especially against textured walls. This is the step. This is the thing that is really kind of mission critical, as hitting that edge. So you can see the outline of it all the way around. I'm more concerned with that than I am with anything in the middle, because we did all of those steps before to make sure that we had a really nice smooth middle. And just before I texture, that's one thing to add to the list of material is I'll be using all-purpose mud for texturing through my hopper. You don't want to use quick setting materials through any kind of tools like that. I guess you could, but don't recommend it. It's not necessary. You can let the material dry and then paint it. It's going to dry pretty quickly. Again, throwing a fan on it, even with regular mud with a orange peel texture, it'll dry pretty quick. So typically you would be painting the next day anyways. This is the step. This is what we're looking for. Is getting that outer edge. Now, we didn't leave much of an edge the way that we did this, the way that we feathered this. But if you're new to patches, you might have left more of an edge. Either way, regardless of how well you did it, this is an important part of the process. If you're newer, I recommend using the fan to get more of that drier, so that you can press a little bit harder if you need to at this stage. I'm just going along, just a light sand. You see that this little edge is starting to fade. This is very not very thin, I should say. Very lightly wetted. Just kind of hitting that. Because of that moisture, I can even kind of rub it in a little bit. This is still pretty wet. I went with the option of not using the fan. But this is hard enough. It has hardened. I do have a couple spots in those chatters that I want to take care of. Just before I texture, I'll just use the all-purpose mud because there's not really much there that actually needs a touch up. So it's not going to take a bunch of mud to fill it up, and neither is it going to shrink very much. We'll go over that on the next step. Okay, I've got my all-purpose in my pan. I've grabbed quite a bit more than what I'm going to need, because I'm going to need to thin this down. We talked about consistencies of mud. This is right out of the box. All-purpose has a lot more glue in it. It is regular mud, it's not a fast setting material. And we're going to thin this down. And what we're looking for is definitely pancake batter. So it's going to be having a really hard time keeping it on your knife if you're going to try to do that upside down test that we were doing before. It's not going to stay on your knife. It's going to be very runny. Just before I mix this up though, I'm gonna hit those 2 spots, or a couple spots. Add just the littlest bitty scratch right here. So our mud is still very wet, and it is very hard and wet, just like all the other steps we've done. So, not concentrating here, so I'm not doing this very well, but again, we're just putting on one way, pulling off the other way. So there's just like a littlest bitty scratch, probably not real necessary, being that we have a textured wall, but if you like to really make sure that everything's really sharp and really good, it's always a good idea to touch up. You're never gonna over touch up anything as long as you're pulling things tight. The way that I'm pulling this, it's even tighter than what we did on the skin coat, so I don't need to worry about sanding these little touch-ups here. And there was this weird little spot up here. Some of these little spots are probably related to that were building on top of the textured surface, and again, these chatters. So on these chatters, I'm actually going to pull it like this, because I just want to fill in some of those. If you can kind of see in the camera, you have these light and dark spots. That's where the it's pulling tighter on the raised surfaces, and it's darker where it's calling for more mud. So that's why you see that. That's actually what I'm trying to fix here. And it's more in this area up here than it was down here. It's probably good enough for what we've got going on here. Pulling this one a little more tight up here, adding a little bit more mud. And keeping it real tight so that we don't have to worry about having to wait for it to dry and sand it or anything like that. Especially because this is regular mud and it would take some time to dry. Alright. We are ready for texture. There are a few little nicks and dings out here on our wall. I'm not really going to bother with those. I probably should. In this case, I don't really want to. All that's doing is just filling them in a little bit without leaving mud that we're going to have to deal with this beyond the little nicks and dings. Can get away with that here a little bit because it is a textured wall. And I'm going to take the sponge after that one. I didn't get, my finger wasn't clean enough to be able to do that. If I were to use a knife on those little dings there, I would have had, more mud to try to clean off and deal with. So here I'm just going to wipe off any mud that's beyond the little nicks and dings. Decided on the fly to do that. So since we're going to be shooting this anyways, we might as well. We'll leave this one a little fuller because we've got to compensate for that shrinkage. I was talking about. Just wipe off any of that. That'll be fine for what we're doing on this one. Just taking care of a few beans. Alright. I'm gonna come back after this mud is mixed. I grabbed more than, I don't think I mentioned why I grabbed more than what I need. We're using a gravity fed hopper. So previously when we're mixing up quickset, we're just trying to mix up just what we needed. But here we've got to have more so that the mud will feed down into the hopper at a consistent rate for us for what we need. Probably way more than what I actually needed even for that reason. This time I am going to use my being that I've got a fuller pan, I'm going to use one of my little mixers here. I've got two types, one that you can buy at your local hardware store that's like a little 1 gallon paint mixer. That's the one that you just saw. And then I also have a pan mixer that's shaped the way that your pan is shaped so that it's not dinging up your pan as you're mixing it up. And I just attach that to a little drill, add some water, and spin that up. So here's the mixer that I was talking about. Got my water in the mud. I just start spinning it up. It's worth noting that this is really nice for quickset. I didn't do that earlier. I was just spinning it up with my 6. There's such a small amount of material. You know, as big as this mixer is, it really wouldn't be doing much for me. It would just kind of be chunking it up, so if you will, being that we have an appropriate amount of material or more, that's where the mixer comes into play and really saves time having to try to do all of that turning with your hand. So consistency, lots of trouble keeping it on your hand. Does not pass the upside down test. Pancake batter, or even just a little thinner, is what you're looking for putting on an orange peel. I'm just doing that in my pan because I'm not going to break out my big heavy drill, mix up tons of material in a bucket. It's just a lot more cleanup and everything for just such a small patch. I do tend to use my hopper a little bit more than the spray cans of texture. By the way, those are great products. You can achieve great results with them. Sometimes the cans are a little hit or miss. You'll get a can that you'll only get half of the material out of it before it stops spraying on you. And you know, every can is like $27. So you can get a hopper at your local hardware store, you know, for $27 or something, and then you have that and you can use it over and over and over again. I have bigger hoppers and I work with spray rigs, and for small little patches, you know, a little hopper does great. The spray cans work great as well. If you're rushed for time and you're working with just a small area, I didn't want to run over to Lowe's and grab a $27 can of spray texture for this little patch. So I've got all the tools and the compressor and the air hose and everything. So for me, it's just as easy to break out the hopper and spray down. Let's talk about the hopper a little bit. It is gravity fed. You can dial them in. So when you pull this trigger, you're both controlling the air and the material flow. So, you know, if you're seasoned and you know you can barely squeeze it and get a finer spray, I'm sorry about some of the kids in the background. I have 5 boys, so you might be hearing some of that. But you get a finer spray and then a fuller squeeze, you get a more material, more air. You also can control your air with this little attachment. You can buy those to add to your hopper. They don't come with the hopper. But if you really crank this in, I suggest playing with this. You get it all the way in, you know that you can just squeeze all the way and you're going to get consistency. So it's a matter of preference, depending on what you're working with. I've worked on some walls that had within the same area different levels of texture. So, you know, thicker versus finer. So in that case, I'll leave this out, and then I can adjust and kind of try to blend it by giving it a few different little pumps, more or less material and air. So in this case, we're going to leave it all the way dialed in. This is fine to medium texture that we're going after. This is the appropriate tip. They come with different tips within inside this, whatever this is. And then we're pretty well set up to be able to hit and match this texture. Before I get going, it is worth mentioning that it's a good idea to test your splatter against a scrap piece of sheetrock or an empty cardboard box, just anything, to make sure that you're getting close to what it is before you just go to start spraying down the wall. So I'm not going to do that for the purpose of the video and brevity today, but I'm going to fill this up and start spraying. Here is the final result. Probably could have gone even a little bit finer, but I think this will dry up nice. You can see here we went beyond what we actually patched. Kind of like that feathering or blending concept. Probably could have even come out on this side just a little bit more, but this will cover. This will paint real nice. And as far as like timing goes, basically with some clipping and final editing that I've done, you saw the whole process almost in real time. This would be considered a patch completed in one trip, and you have a nice product that's ready for paint.